Hello readers, welcome or welcome back. Today I'm going to be talking about Maurice by E.M. Forster. So originally published in 1971, a year after the author's death, the transcript was actually completed in 1913. The author believed the story would not be deemed accessible to publishers, hence the long delay between the manuscript completion and publication. Now to dive into our overview. Maurice follows an English middle-class gentleman's coming of age and sexual exploration during his time as a student at Cambridge College and the years ensuing. Now to dive into the plot and pacing. Maurice is a study of British society during the early 1900s, specifically through the lens of a young gentleman who in many ways is the epitome of what English society strived to be at that time. Maurice begins a torturous journey of introspection and starts to question his life, his character, and the character of those around him. He also begins to question if the ideas England is claiming to stand for are worth defending. This story has a medium pace but kept my attention throughout. Now to give an overview of some of the characters. So firstly, we have Maurice, who is the story's protagonist. He begins the novel as a young boy, likable but not particularly distinctive. Maurice is not particularly intelligent, and in many ways, he's not exposed to particular realities of the world. It's worth noting that he's also a hypocrite and a misogynist. I think in many ways his character as a whole is a direct reflection of English society at the time. Next we have Clive, who is Maurice's school friend at Cambridge. Clive is to be a politician and his family owns a decrepit estate in the English countryside. Maurice and Clive become inseparable and begin a romantic relationship. The last character I want to talk about is Alec, who is a young man in the employ of Clive's family. Alec is of the English working class and he's set to leave England to work in Argentina with his brother. Now to discuss some of the prevalent themes in the story. So firstly, we have English society and the hypocrisy within. So to dive a bit deeper, we see hypocrisy particularly in a religious vein. There's a pretty big sequence in the story where Maurice is arguing with Clive about religion and the existence of it, and Clive is able to convince Maurice that religion doesn't exist because Maurice has no way of getting a logical point to prove the existence of it. Clive then tells Maurice that he begins to abstain from communion at his church, and initially his family didn't particularly care, but his mother eventually did get on to him about it and got rather upset. Upon hearing this, Maurice decides that he too will stop partaking of communion, and when he does, no one has any reaction. And because of this, his action is to blame English society for their entire lack of morality. And essentially, he begins to question if England stands for anything because he was expecting an outcry at his refusal to partake of the communion. I didn't really do that scene justice, but it's actually a pretty humorous moment in the story, but it still kind of begins to show all of the cracks, both within Maurice having this really exaggerated reaction, but also England in itself. Maurice's comment is ultimately true. England seems to be a holier-than-thou Christian society, but a gentleman like himself doesn't go to church and there's no reaction at all. So really, where's kind of the importance of religion and within English society? Beyond the hypocrisy, we also see classism and sexism, both of which Maurice employs on judging his sisters and his mother, who he once was enamored with, judging working class or servants within his household or the households of his friends. Beyond all of the general hate and spite that we see through all of these ideals, we also see an underlying quality of laissez-faire and a laziness that permeates the genteel class of England or English society at this time. There's this idea of decaying society and things that are falling apart because no one's really willing to fight for them. But it's this duality between the idea of English people having very strict values and ideals in terms of religious sovereignty or morality, mixed with the idea of ultimately, do they really care that much about anything, as Maurice starts to question through his kind of escapade that we talked about in the example earlier. And ultimately, what Maurice comes to discover and note about English society is that they desire shelter above all else. He essentially remarks that because of their comfort in shelter, they ignore the existence of things like the sky and ultimately sacrifice their joy through their pursuit of shelter. He resolves that ultimately, to find happiness, he must live outside of class and prioritize love above all else. Now to dive into some of the good and bad elements of the story. I thought that this was absolutely beautifully written. To me, it reads like a great classic novel. The language is elevated, the style is poetic, it's descriptive and emotive. In some ways, this feels like it was written without fear, potentially because the author never really had any intentions or thought that this could be published. So it felt like they wrote the story without censorship or fear of consequence. They weren't afraid to make characters like Maurice or Clive flawed or even unlikable because they're trying to depict a real, true story of real life and not one-dimensional characters. Secondly, the author actually ultimately writes a happy ending for Maurice, which was probably extremely not only unlikely but unthinkable at this time, particularly in England. And other than Maurice kind of just being a jerk through some parts of the story, I don't really have any bad elements because I really, again, felt like those make sense for what the author is ultimately trying to tell in terms of the story of England as a whole and the story of Maurice's evolution as well through that lens. So while you're reading it, you may think, wow, this guy's a jerk. But ultimately, it's serving a greater purpose of his transformation. Now to go into my final thoughts. I loved Maurice. I thoroughly enjoyed this read from the beginning to the end. I thought it was so well written. It truly read like a classic story that I really enjoyed reading in high school or something like that. And honestly, I think that this is something that we should be teaching in schools. The writing, certainly kids can get a lot out of it, but the story in itself is beautiful and modern and flawed, but it teaches us. I think there's so much that can be gained from looking into this story, and I think it's honestly just a lot more enjoyable than something like Dickens or one of those types of stories, for me at least. If you're somebody who likes elevated writing, who likes romantic stories, who likes classics, I think this would definitely be a really great read for you. I loved it. I know it's probably not for everybody, but I thought it was really fantastic. If anybody else has read Maurice, please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. As always, thanks everybody so much for watching, and I will see you on the next one.